So the rich will always be rich, but that's only about 5% of the population. My concern is, the reason I wrote Rich Dad, Poor Dad, is the gap between the rich and poor is too wide today. And when Biden took the XL pipeline off the line and blamed Russia for the price of oil going up, the middle class is toast. The poor will always be poor, but now the middle class is going to get poor.
I'm going to shift away from gold to another asset that you tweeted about recently, Robert, and that's tuna. Because you recently tweeted that the best investment is, and I'm quoting you, cans of tuna fish, inflation about to take off, best investments are cans of tuna and baked beans. You can't eat gold, silver, or Bitcoin. You can eat cans of tuna and baked beans. Food, most important, starvation, next problem, invest in the solution. All right, so Robert, go on.
Because tuna is dependent upon diesel, as you know. If the fleets can't get out to get the tuna, they need diesel. So the more when Biden took the Keystone XL pipeline off, discontinued the pipeline from Canada to America, I knew Biden's a communist. What he did destroyed the middle class of America. See, the poor in America is already poor. They'll always be poor. But when he took the Keystone XL pipeline off, he destroyed the middle class because civilization runs on fuel and food.
Right.
So that's why it's fuel and food, gold, silver, Bitcoin. And so when Biden cut off the Keystone XL pipeline, he destroyed the middle class of America. And, he is doing exactly what Marx said to do. Biden is not a good man.
Well, Robert, sticking with this idea of the food shortages that we're seeing, which are very real, we're clearly seeing food supply issues, many of them self-inflicted, with forced cutbacks on fertilizers to reduce nitrogen emissions under the environmental narrative, which you said is a Trojan horse for Marxism in your book, which we'll get to as well. We're seeing this happen in Sri Lanka. We saw how that reduced the crop yields. We saw the protests that resulted in. We're seeing Canada looking at implementing similar policies. But when you say starvation is the next problem, exactly how pervasive and severe do you think this is?
Well, I'm concerned, put it that way. I like to eat.
As do we all, Robert, as do we all. It's one of those life necessities, right?
So that it was kind of tongue-in-cheek when I said buy tuna cans of tuna, because tuna takes diesel. I also invest in Wagyu cattle.
Mm-hmm.
Why Wagyu cattle? Because Wagyu cannot be printed. Anything that can be printed, like a stock certificate, a bond, or dollar, I don't want. So when I was a kid, I used to go watch the breeding bulls at the dairy have sex with cows. I said, someday when I grow up, I was 15 years old, I said, I'd like to be a breeding bull someday.
A 15-year-old watching cattle breed. Yeah, I can imagine that brought up a lot of interesting thoughts back then, Robert.
So I buy a breeding bull at Wagyu because it's a brand. Rich will always have money, as you know. The top 5% will always be rich. So I buy Wagyu because they'll buy Wagyu before they buy hamburger. But the thing about it is, with the Wagyu, it's not the beef, it's the semen. And so, and the breeding bull is always, and they freeze it. And then you get a percentage of the cow you breed.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll say it again, I like gold, silver, Bitcoin, and mines and oil because you can't print it. So I'm a hardcore gold, silver, oil buff, food buff.
And cattle, and frozen cattle, sperm, yes. And cattle, and ways to invest in cattle. So for our viewers, Robert, who may be worried about a potential food crisis, what is your advice to them? Where should they be investing?
Well, a lot of people talk about farmland and all that stuff, but I think cattle are great. You can always eat the thing. So I have a lot of Wagyu bulls, and I sell again the semen, which is freeze-dried, or crypto, what do they call it? So the rich will always be rich, but that's only about 5% of the population. My concern is, the reason I wrote Rich Dad, Poor Dad, is the gap between the rich and poor is too wide today. And when Biden took the XL pipeline off the line and blamed Russia for the price of oil going up, the middle class is toast. The poor will always be poor, but now the middle class is going to get poor. And that's why I talk about, who stole my pension and all this, because the pensions came in 1974 with a thing called the 401k or ERISA. 1974 was the first year Americans could also own gold legally. So as I write about in my books, I had to smuggle gold in from Vietnam because I came back into the States in 73 and it was illegal for Americans to own gold, which I thought was really interesting. But that made me a hardcore gold bug.
Right.
So that's why Jim Records and I were joined at the hip. And I agree, I like his numbers. I think 15,000 is not out of the question for gold.
Does he have a timeline for that? Do you have a timeline for that?
No, right now I'm just glad I can acquire more of it.
Right. Well, you talk about the Biden administration's war on energy, and the fact is that first day in office, the Biden administration did cut off the Keystone pipeline, did impose stricter regulations on the domestic oil and gas sector, and then at the same time gave the green light for the Nord Stream pipeline between Russia and Germany. And we're seeing how that's playing out with the Germans now being held captive to Russia with regards to their energy needs. And a lot of this is under the narrative of climate change, saving the environment, the environmental movement. And in your book, you call that the Trojan horse of Marxism. Expand on what you mean by that, on how the environmental movement is the Trojan horse of Marxism these days.
Well, because nobody's going to disagree with them. Nobody's going to say, yeah, I want the environment destroyed. But this is my friend here, Donald Trump, and I wrote 2 books together, and he warned Germany. He says, you better watch out because you're too dependent upon Russia for your fuel.
That he did.
And the Germans laughed at him. But Trump and I are joined at the hip also, like Rickards and I. And if they can destroy the middle class, that's what they want. Let me read another quote from Marx. He says, and Biden just appointed 87,000 new IRS agents, Internal Revenue agents. They're going after the small business owner. They cannot touch guys like me. I have too much money, and I have best attorneys, best accountants. But let's say the small restaurant owner or the small entrepreneur, they're going to get them. So this is what Marx said about income tax. He says, well, a heavy or progressive income tax is necessary for the development of communism. And America was founded as a tax-free nation. 1773, the Boston Tea Party. Just study your history.
Yeah.
So these socialists come in under the guise of being environmentalists, and who can fight against it? I don't want the environment destroyed. But they do that, and then they destroy Sri Lanka. They now have carbon credits. I'm making a lot of money off of that also. But I'm concerned of what the communists, the Marxists, are doing to the free world. That's my concern. These are U.S. Marine Corps wings. I flew for the U.S. Somebody asked, did you fly for the Japan Marine Corps? I said, no, I flew for the U.S. Marine Corps. We're immigrants. I'm 4th generation Japanese American. And all my relatives fought for America in World War II against the Japanese, against the Germans, against the Italians. So fighting for freedom is part of my heritage as an American, Japanese American.